Is there anything more dangerous than an intelligent killer? Yes, an intelligent killer who can't resist documenting their brilliance. In the heart of the French Quarter, where jazz music echoes through narrow streets, a seemingly perfect crime was about to be unraveled by the one thing the criminal couldn't control: their need to preserve every moment of their triumph. Marcel Fontaine died believing he had taken his secrets to the grave. He didn't know that his killer had created a detailed record that would become their death sentence. The humid August air clung to Detective Camille Thibodeau's skin like a second layer as she stepped out of her patrol car onto Dauphine Street. The French Quarter was never truly quiet, but at 3:47 a.m., even the most dedicated revelers had surrendered to the oppressive heat that made New Orleans summers legendary. The only sounds were the distant hum of air conditioners working overtime and the soft jazz melody drifting from a late-night radio somewhere in the darkness. Blue Moon stood before her like a sleeping giant, its neon sign flickering intermittently, casting eerie blue shadows across the wet pavement. The famous jazz club had been Marcel Fontaine's kingdom for over 2 decades, a place where tourists and locals alike came to lose themselves in the sultry rhythms that defined the city's soul. Tonight, it had become a crime scene. Officer Rodriguez met her at the entrance, his usually steady hands trembling slightly as he lit his third cigarette of the hour. "Detective, we got a real strange one here," he said, exhaling smoke into the thick air. "Marcel Fontaine, 52, found dead in his office about an hour ago. Door was locked from the inside, key still in his pocket." Thibodeau nodded, her keen eyes already scanning the club's exterior. 23 years on the force had taught her that the devil was always in the details others missed. "Who found him?" "Night janitor, Louis Boudreau. Says he came in to clean around 2:30. Noticed. The office light still on. When Marcel didn't answer his knocks, he got worried and called us, had to break down the door." The interior of Blue Moon felt like stepping into another era. Dim lighting cast long shadows across empty tables, still adorned with the remnants of the evening's final set. Abandoned cocktail glasses, crumpled napkins, and the lingering scent of expensive cigars mixed with something else Thibodeau couldn't quite identify. Marcel Fontaine's office was tucked away behind the main stage, accessible through a narrow hallway lined with black and white photographs of jazz legends who had graced his stage over the years. The broken door hung at an odd angle, splinters of dark wood scattered across the threshold like breadcrumbs leading to a gingerbread house of secrets. Inside, Marcel sat slumped over his mahogany desk, his silver hair catching the light from the antique banker's lamp that still burned beside him. His expensive suit was wrinkled but undisturbed, his gold wedding ring, a curious detail for a man divorced 3 years ago, glinting on his left hand. To most observers, it would appear that Marcel Fontaine had simply worked too late and paid the ultimate price for his dedication. But Camille Thibodeau wasn't most observers. She moved slowly around the desk, her trained eyes cataloguing every detail. A half-empty bottle of Hennessy sat open near his right hand, but the crystal tumbler beside it remained untouched, the amber liquid still reaching the rim. Strange. Marcel was known for his appreciation of fine bourbon, yet he hadn't taken a single sip. The positioning troubled her too. Marcel's head rested at an unnatural angle against his left arm, as if he had been trying to reach for something when he collapsed. His reading glasses lay crushed beneath his chest, the expensive frames bent beyond repair. But what had he been reading? The desk was impeccably clean, except for a single, leather-bound appointment book, open to today's date. The last entry read, 11:10 p.m., CM, private. "Rodriguez," she called softly, not wanting to disturb the scene more than necessary. "Did the janitor mention seeing anyone else tonight? Any late visitors?" "Says the place was empty when he arrived, but..." Rodriguez hesitated, glancing around nervously. "He mentioned something odd. Said there was a smell in the air when he first walked in. Something floral, like expensive. Perfume, but it was gone by the time we got here." Thibodeau inhaled deeply. The mysterious scent Rodriguez mentioned had indeed faded, replaced by the clinical smell of death and the mustiness that accumulated in old buildings during humid summers. But if Louis was right, someone had been here recently, someone who wore expensive perfume and had a private appointment with Marcel at 11 p.m. She knelt beside the body, careful not to disturb anything. Marcel's skin had the waxy pallor of recent death, but there were no obvious signs of trauma. No blood, no wounds, no signs of a struggle. His fingernails were clean, his clothes unruffled. Everything pointed to natural causes. A heart attack, perhaps, brought on by stress and too many late nights managing his beloved club. Yet something felt wrong. In her experience, people who died of sudden cardiac events rarely maintained such a peaceful expression. Marcel's face showed no signs of the pain or panic typically associated with heart attacks. Instead, he looked almost serene, as if he had simply drifted off to sleep at his desk. The medical examiner would provide the official cause of death, but Camille's instincts were already whispering that this case was far from closed. As she prepared to secure the scene and begin the formal investigation, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been very careful to make Marcel Fontaine's death appear natural. What they hadn't counted on was Detective Camille Thibodeau's refusal to accept the obvious answer. In her experience, when something looked too perfect, it usually was. Dawn crept slowly over the French Quarter as Detective Thibodeau began piecing together the final hours of Marcel Fontaine's life. The coroner's preliminary examination had raised more questions than answers. No obvious cause of death, no signs of violence, but something Dr. Vivienne Leblanc couldn't quite put her finger on. "I'll need to run a full toxicology panel," she had whispered to Thibodeau before the body was removed. "Something about this doesn't feel natural." By 8 a.m., the Blue Moon had been transformed from a crime scene back into what appeared to be an ordinary jazz club, but Thibodeau knew better. She had spent the morning interviewing the club's employees, and each conversation had revealed another layer of Marcel's complicated life. The successful businessman who charmed tourists and locals alike had been harboring secrets that ran deeper than the Mississippi. Her first formal interview was with Etienne Broussard, Marcel's business partner of 15 years. They met at Café du Monde, where the aroma of fresh beignets mixed with the heavy scent of chicory coffee, creating an almost intoxicating blend that reminded every visitor why New Orleans was unlike anywhere else on Earth. Etienne arrived precisely on time, his usually immaculate appearance showing subtle signs of stress. His designer shirt was wrinkled, his normally perfect hair disheveled, and his hands shook slightly as he stirred sugar into his café au lait. At 48, he had always been the more reserved partner, handling the business side while Marcel worked his magic with customers and performers. "Marcel was like a brother to me," Etienne began, his Creole accent thickening with emotion. "We built that club from nothing, started with a broken-down building and a dream of bringing real jazz back to the Quarter." His eyes darted nervously around the cafe, never quite meeting Thibodeau's direct gaze. But as their conversation deepened, cracks began to appear in Etienne's grief-stricken facade. When Thibodeau asked about the club's finances, his answers became evasive. When she mentioned Marcel's appointment book entry for CM Private, Etienne's coffee cup clinked against the saucer with an audible tremor. "Detective, I handle the books, but Marcel, he had his own arrangements. Sometimes private loans, special deals with certain customers. I didn't always know the details." The admission came reluctantly, as if each word was being extracted against his will. Further probing revealed that Etienne had been struggling with gambling debts that Marcel had recently discovered. He found out about the poker games, the sports betting. Marcel was furious, said I was putting the club at risk. We argued about it just last week. Etienne's voice dropped to barely a whisper. He threatened to buy out my share, said he couldn't trust me anymore. From Café du Monde, Thibodeau drove through the Garden District to an elegant art gallery on Magazine Street. The contrast between the touristy bustle of the Quarter and the refined sophistication of this neighborhood was stark, yet both were quintessentially New Orleans. Here, among million-dollar mansions draped in Spanish moss, she would meet Marcel's most complicated relationship. Céleste Moreau's gallery occupied a converted Creole cottage painted in soft blues and grays. The interior was a study in refined taste. Contemporary art hung alongside antique furniture, creating an atmosphere that was both modern and respectfully Southern. Céleste herself embodied this same contradiction, a successful 45-year-old businesswoman who had never quite let go of her passionate past with Marcel. "Marcel and I had what you might call an understanding," Céleste explained as she led Thibodeau through the gallery. Her voice carried the cultured tones of old New Orleans money, but her eyes held secrets. "We ended our romantic relationship 3 years ago when he divorced his wife, but we remained close friends." The euphemism hung in the air like incense. Thibodeau had learned that in New Orleans, close friends often meant something far more complicated, especially when expensive perfume and private late-night appointments were involved. Céleste's alibi for The previous evening was elaborate yet strangely incomplete. She claimed to have been hosting a private showing for a potential collector from Houston, but when pressed for details, she couldn't provide the client's contact information. He paid in cash and preferred to remain anonymous. It's not uncommon in my business, detective. Wealthy collectors often value their privacy, but it was Celeste's reaction to Marcel's death that troubled Thibodeau most. While she expressed appropriate sadness, there was an underlying tension, as if she was relieved rather than devastated. When asked about Marcel's recent mood, she hesitated before admitting, Marcel had been receiving some troubling phone calls lately. Someone was asking about old business arrangements, things from years ago that should have stayed buried. The third suspect emerged from an entirely different world. Jasper Kirkwood lived in a cramped apartment above a used bookstore in the Marigny, surrounded by jazz memorabilia that would have impressed even the most dedicated collector. At 38, he was a freelance music journalist who spent most nights haunting the clubs of the quarter, documenting every performance, every nuance of the city's musical heritage. His obsession with Marcel Fontaine bordered on unhealthy worship. The walls of his apartment were covered with photographs of Marcel, some taken at public events, others clearly shot from a distance without permission. Detailed calendar marked every night Jasper had attended Blue Moon performances, complete with notes about Marcel's mood, his interactions with customers, even what he wore. Marcel was a genius, Jasper explained, his pale hands gesturing frantically as he spoke. He understood jazz in a way that few people do anymore. Every night at Blue Moon was like witnessing history being made. His knowledge of Marcel's habits was encyclopedic and deeply unsettling. Jasper knew that Marcel always stayed late on Wednesdays to review the week's bookings. He knew that Marcel preferred Hennessy, but rarely drank before midnight. He knew about the locked office, the private appointments, even the specific cologne Marcel wore. Most disturbing of all, he had detailed journals documenting Marcel's every public moment for the past 2 years. I was there last night until closing, Jasper admitted, but I left around 11:30 when Marcel went into his office for his appointment. Knew better than to intrude on his private business. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the quarter, Thibodeau found herself with 3 suspects, each with motive, opportunity, and secrets they were desperate to protect. Etienne's financial troubles, Celeste's mysterious relationship, and Jasper's obsessive behavior all pointed toward potential violence. But which one had crossed the line from secrecy to murder? The answer, she was beginning to suspect, lay hidden in the shadows of Marcel's past, waiting to be uncovered by someone patient enough to look beyond the obvious. The forensics report arrived at Thibodeau's desk as the afternoon heat began its familiar assault on the city. Dr. Leblanc's findings were as puzzling as they were disturbing. Marcel Fontaine had indeed died of cardiac arrest, but his heart showed no signs of the blockages or abnormalities typically associated with sudden death. More intriguingly, traces of an exotic plant compound had been found in his system. Not enough to be immediately lethal, but sufficient to cause the kind of gradual heart failure that would appear completely natural. Oleander extract, Dr. Leblanc explained over the phone, her voice tight with professional concern. It's a clever choice if someone wanted to commit murder. Causes cardiac arrest that's virtually indistinguishable from natural causes unless you know exactly what to look for. The killer would need significant botanical knowledge and access to concentrated plant toxins. This revelation transformed everything. Marcel Fontaine hadn't died of stress or overwork. He had been poisoned by someone with both the knowledge and the patience to plan a nearly perfect murder. But which of her suspects had the expertise to extract and administer such a sophisticated toxin? Thibodeau's investigation into Etienne Broussard's financial troubles had uncovered a web of deception that ran deeper than simple gambling debts. Panky. Records revealed a series of unexplained cash deposits over the past 6 months, each coinciding with major wins at underground poker games that operated in the back rooms of certain quarter establishments. But the amounts were inconsistent with normal gambling patterns, too large, too regular, and most importantly, too well timed with the club's busiest nights. When confronted with this evidence at the police station, Etienne's carefully constructed facade finally cracked. "You don't understand," he pleaded, sweat beading on his forehead despite the aggressive air conditioning. "Those weren't gambling winnings. Marcel was being blackmailed, and I was helping him pay." The story that emerged was both shocking and believable. Someone had been extorting money from Marcel for months, threatening to reveal information that would destroy both his reputation and the club's standing in the community. Etienne had been Marcel's intermediary, using his gambling connections to launder the blackmail payments and make them appear as legitimate winnings. Marcel never told me what they had on him, Etienne insisted. He just said it was something from his past, before the club, before he became respectable. All I know is that whoever was blackmailing him knew details about Marcel's life that even I didn't know. But Etienne's alibi for the night of the murder remained problematic. He claimed to have been at a private poker game in a warehouse, district loft, but the other players were career criminals unlikely to cooperate with police. His story was convenient, unverifiable, and potentially fabricated to cover his tracks. Celeste Moreau's mysterious art collector proved equally elusive under scrutiny. Security cameras from neighboring businesses showed no evidence of anyone matching her description entering or leaving her gallery during the supposed private showing. More damaging still, her own gallery's security system had been deliberately disabled between 9 p.m. and midnight, a fact she had conveniently forgotten to mention during their first interview. When Thibodeau confronted her at the gallery the following evening, Celeste's sophisticated composure finally wavered. Marcel was being destroyed by whatever hold this person had over him, she admitted, her fingers nervously adjusting the paintings on nearby walls. He'd lost weight, couldn't sleep, jumped every time his phone rang. I told him to go to the police, but he said it would only make things worse. The revelation that Celeste knew about the blackmail added another layer to her potential motive. Marcel's emotional distress had been affecting their relationship, and she had grown increasingly frustrated with his refusal to confide in her completely. He was pulling away from everyone who cared about him, she said bitterly. Maybe he thought protecting us was more important than trusting us. But Celeste's knowledge of botanical poisons proved surprisingly extensive. Her gallery specialized in historical botanical prints, and she had studied plant-based pigments and dyes for her restoration work. She owned several books on poisonous plants and had even written articles about the deadly flora depicted in 18th century art. Most incriminating of all, oleander grew wild in her Garden District neighborhood, easily accessible to someone who knew what they were looking for. Jasper Kirkwood's obsessive documentation of Marcel's life took on a sinister new dimension when viewed through the lens of premeditated murder. His journals didn't just record Marcel's public appearances, they contained detailed observations about his private habits, his stress levels, his health, and most disturbingly, his increasingly paranoid behavior in recent months. Marcel was scared, Jasper revealed during his second interview, his pale eyes gleaming with an intensity that made Thibodeau's skin crawl. He kept looking over his shoulder, checking his phone, acting like someone was watching him, which of course I was, but he didn't know that. Jasper's apartment search had uncovered a treasure trove of disturbing evidence. Beyond the photographs and calendars, investigators found detailed floor plans of Blue Moon, Marcel's home address and daily routine, even copies of his credit card statements obtained through methods Jasper refused to explain. Most chilling of all was a collection of Marcel's personal items, a coffee cup from the club, a pen from his office, a napkin with his fingerprints. I wasn't stalking him, Jasper protested when confronted with this evidence. I was documenting a living legend. Future jazz historians will thank me for preserving these details about Marcel's daily life. But Jasper's extensive knowledge of Marcel's routine would have made him the perfect candidate to administer poison at just the right moment. He knew Marcel's schedule, his habits, his vulnerabilities. More importantly, his background in freelance journalism had given him research skills that could easily have uncovered information about plant-based toxins. As night fell over the quarter and the familiar sounds of jazz began drifting from reopened clubs, Thibodeau found herself with three suspects who all had means, motive, and opportunity. Each had lied about their alibis, each had access to oleander, and each had intimate knowledge of Marcel's habits that could have facilitated murder. But something still felt wrong about the entire investigation. The blackmail angle suggested a fourth party, someone with enough leverage over Marcel to drive him to desperate measures. The careful timing of the poison, the meticulous staging of the scene, the sophisticated knowledge required to extract and administer oleander, it all pointed to a level of planning that went beyond simple crimes of passion. Standing in her office, as the evening shift began, Thibodeau stared at the evidence board she had created, trying to find the pattern that would reveal the truth. 3 suspects, multiple motives, conflicting evidence, and somewhere in the shadows, a blackmailer whose identity remained frustratingly elusive. The killer had made one crucial mistake, though. They had underestimated Detective Camille Thibodeau's refusal to accept convenient answers. Tomorrow, she would dig deeper into Marcel's past, follow the money trail from the blackmail payments, and find the missing piece that would bring this perfectly planned murder crashing down. The breakthrough came at 6:23 a.m. on a Thursday morning, wrapped in the kind of humid fog that made New Orleans feel like a city suspended between dreams and reality. Thibodeau had spent the night reviewing Marcel's financial records, tracing the blackmail payments through a labyrinth of cash transactions and shell companies. What she discovered led her to a storage unit in Metairie, rented under a false name but paid for with funds that originated from Blue Moon's accounts. The storage facility sat on a desolate stretch of highway, surrounded by the kind of industrial wasteland that existed in the shadows of every major city. Unit 247 had been rented 6 months ago by someone calling himself James Morrison, an obvious reference to the jazz legend, and a clue that this mystery was intimately connected to Marcel's world. When the bolt cutters finally severed the lock, the metal door rolled up to reveal a space that looked more like a private office than storage. Filing cabinets lined the walls, filled with documents dating back 20 years. Photographs covered every available surface, some of Marcel but many of other people Thibodeau didn't recognize. In the center of the room sat a simple wooden desk, and on that desk lay an item that would change everything. A leather-bound journal, its pages filled with meticulous handwriting. The diary's first entry was dated 8 months ago, and its opening lines sent a chill through Thibodeau's spine. Marcel Fontaine believes he has escaped his past, but some sins follow you forever. Today, I begin documenting the planning of his perfect demise. He will die believing it was natural, never knowing that justice has finally found him. Page after page revealed the methodical planning of Marcel's murder. The killer had researched oleander extraction techniques, studied Marcel's daily routines, analyzed his health records, and calculated the exact dosage needed to cause cardiac arrest without leaving obvious traces. But more than just a murder plan, the diary read like the manifesto of someone convinced they were performing a righteous act of vengeance. Day 127, Marcel's routine remains consistent. He stays late every Wednesday to review bookings. His office door locks from the inside, making it the perfect location for what must appear to be natural death. I have confirmed that he drinks Hennessy after 11 p.m. but never before. This gives me a precise window for administration. Day 203. The oleander extraction is complete. 3 attempts were required to achieve the proper concentration. The compound is odorless and nearly tasteless when properly prepared. Marcel will never know what he's consuming. But it was the diary's revelation about motive that shocked Thibodeau most. Marcel's blackmailer and his killer were the same person, and their connection to him stretched back decades to a time when Marcel Fontaine had been a very different man. Before Blue Moon, before his respectable life in New Orleans, Marcel had been involved in illegal activities that had destroyed someone's family. Day 89. Marcel has no idea that his past in Miami has finally caught up with him. He thinks he can buy his way out of this situation, just like he bought his way out of everything else. But money cannot resurrect the dead or heal the damage he caused. Sarah died because of his greed, and he will pay for that with his life. The name Sarah appeared throughout the diary's pages, always in the context of someone who had died because of Marcel's actions. The killer wrote about her with a reverence that suggested deep personal connection, a sister perhaps, or a lover, someone whose death had been the catalyst for this elaborate revenge plot. Day 156. I have made contact with Etienne Broussard. His gambling debts make him vulnerable to manipulation. He doesn't know he's helping me launder my blackmail payments, but his cooperation is essential to maintaining the illusion that Marcel is being extorted by a stranger. The diary revealed that Etienne's involvement had been orchestrated from the beginning. The killer had identified his weakness for gambling and systematically created situations where Etienne would accumulate debts. When the pressure became unbearable, they had approached him with what seemed like a solution: help Marcel pay his blackmail debts and everyone's problems would disappear. Day 178. Celeste Moreau suspects something is wrong with Marcel, but she doesn't know how right she is. Her knowledge of botanical poisons makes her a perfect red herring. If the investigation goes deeper than I anticipate, she will naturally become a suspect. Her guilt over their affair will prevent her from providing convincing alibis. The calculating nature of these entries was chilling. The killer hadn't just planned Marcel's death, they had engineered an entire web of suspicion designed to protect their identity. Celeste's expertise with plants, Etienne's financial troubles, even Jasper's obsessive behavior had all been factored into the plan. Day 201. Jasper Kirkwood's documentation of Marcel's life is becoming useful intelligence. His journals contain details about Marcel's habits that even I hadn't. I observed. I've been encouraging his obsession through anonymous tips about Marcel's schedule. He believes he's conducting independent research, but he's actually helping me perfect my timing. The killer had been manipulating Jasper's obsession, feeding him information that would make his documentation more thorough, while simultaneously ensuring that his stalker-like behavior would make him an obvious suspect. Every aspect of the investigation had been anticipated and planned for. But as Thibodeau read deeper into the diary, she realized that the killer's greatest strength, their meticulous documentation, was also their fatal weakness. The journal contained not just plans and observations, but also personal reflections that revealed crucial details about their identity. Day 233. Visiting New Orleans always brings back memories of the life I could have had. Before Miami, before Marcel destroyed everything, I had dreams of my own. Sarah and I used to talk about opening a restaurant together, somewhere in the quarter where we could serve authentic Creole food and listen to jazz every night. Marcel took that dream away when he took her life. The references to Creole cuisine and intimate knowledge of New Orleans suggested someone with deep roots in the city. But more importantly, the killer's writing style and specific word choices began to form a pattern that felt familiar. Thibodeau had encountered this particular combination of eloquence and bitterness during her interviews. Day 267. The final preparation is complete. Tomorrow night, Marcel Fontaine will drink his last glass of Hennessy. He will die alone in his office, never understanding that his death is justice for Sarah's life. And I will finally be free from the weight of carrying this secret for 20 years. As Thibodeau photographed each page of the diary, her phone buzzed with an urgent message from forensics. DNA analysis of trace evidence from Marcel's office had revealed an unexpected match. Skin cells found on the door handle belonged to someone who had been in the police database for years, someone whose prints were on file from a professional licensing background check. The killer's identity was finally within reach, hidden in plain sight among the 3 suspects she had been pursuing. But first, she needed to understand the full scope of Sarah's story and Marcel's role in her death. The diary had given her the roadmap to solving the murder, but the final confrontation would require her to uncover truths that had been buried for 2 decades. Standing in that storage unit, surrounded by the evidence of a perfectly planned revenge, Thibodeau realized she was about to close a case that began long before Marcel Fontaine took his final breath in the Blue Moon's office. The DNA match came back with a name that made Thibodeau's blood run cold: Dr. Vivienne Leblanc, the medical examiner who had been helping investigate Marcel's death, was the same person who had orchestrated his murder. For 24 hours, Thibodeau had been working alongside the killer, sharing evidence and theories, while the doctor carefully guided the investigation away from the truth. Armed with this revelation and the damning diary evidence, Thibodeau began piecing together the full scope of Dr. Leblanc's deception. The toxicology report that had revealed oleander poisoning wasn't a breakthrough in the investigation, it was part of the killer's plan. Vivian had wanted the poison discovered, but only after she had positioned herself as the expert helping to solve the case. The connection to Sarah emerged from records Thibodeau found buried in Miami police archives. 23 years ago, Sarah LeBlanc had been a promising culinary student with dreams of opening her own restaurant. She had become involved with Marcel Fontaine, who was then running an illegal gambling operation that laundered money through a chain of Miami nightclubs. When Sarah discovered the true nature of his business and threatened to expose him, Marcel had orchestrated her silence in the most permanent way possible. Sarah's death had been ruled a suicide, a young woman overwhelmed by the pressures of school and a failing relationship. But her sister Vivienne, then a pre-med student, had never believed the official story. She had spent years investigating Marcel's role in Sarah's death, following his trail from Miami to New Orleans, watching and waiting for the perfect opportunity for revenge. The confrontation took place where it had all begun, in Marcel's office at Blue Moon. Thibodeau had arranged to meet Dr. Leblanc there, under the pretense of reviewing additional forensic evidence. The club was closed, its familiar warmth replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to echo with the weight of buried secrets. "You've been very thorough, Detective," Vivienne said as she entered the office where Marcel had died just 4 days earlier. At 45, she was an elegant woman whose professional demeanor had always concealed the burning rage that had driven her for over 2 decades. "I wondered how long it would take you to connect the pieces." "Sarah was your sister," Thibodeau stated, her hand resting casually near her service weapon. "Marcel killed her in Miami, and you've spent 20 years planning your revenge." Vivienne's composed mask finally slipped, revealing the raw pain that had motivated every calculated move. "Sarah was brilliant, Detective. She had dreams, talent, a future full of possibilities. Marcel destroyed all of that because she threatened to expose his criminal operation to the authorities." The story that emerged was both tragic and terrifying in its scope. Marcel had been running a money laundering scheme through a network of Florida nightclubs, cleaning drug money through fake gambling winnings and inflated liquor sales. Sarah had discovered the operation when she noticed irregularities in the books of a restaurant where she worked part-time, a restaurant that was unknowingly part of Marcel's network. She went to him with evidence, thinking she could convince him to stop, Vivienne continued, her voice breaking with long-suppressed emotion. She believed people could change, that love could redeem even someone like Marcel. Instead, he arranged for her death and made it look like suicide. The elaborate nature of Vivienne's revenge plan became clear as she described 2 decades of preparation. She had deliberately pursued a career in forensic pathology, specializing in toxicology, so she would have both the knowledge and access necessary to commit the perfect murder. She had tracked Marcel's movements for years, waiting for him to establish himself in a new life before striking. "The blackmail was never about money," she explained. "I wanted him to experience the fear and desperation that Sarah felt in her final days. I wanted him to understand what it meant to have your entire life threatened by someone with power over you." Vivienne had orchestrated every aspect of the investigation's misdirection. She had manipulated Etienne through his gambling addiction, knowing that his desperate need for money would make him vulnerable to becoming an unwitting accomplice. She had studied Celeste's background in botanical art, ensuring that the gallery owner's knowledge of poisonous plants would make her a natural suspect. And she had encouraged Jasper's obsession with Marcel, feeding him information that would both aid her surveillance and eventually make him appear guilty. "Even your involvement was planned," Vivienne admitted with cold satisfaction. "I specifically requested that you be assigned to this case. Your reputation for persistence meant that you would uncover the evidence I wanted discovered, but only after I had positioned myself as your trusted expert." The diary had been the crucial element of her plan, not just a record of her preparations, but also insurance against the possibility that the murder might not be investigated at all. If Marcel's death had been ruled natural, the diary would have eventually been discovered, triggering a posthumous investigation that would reveal the truth about his past crimes. "The only thing I didn't anticipate," Vivienne said with a bitter smile, "was how satisfying it would be to watch him die. 20 years of planning, and in the end it was over in minutes." Marcel Fontaine took his final breath, never knowing that justice had finally found him. As backup units surrounded the club and Vivienne was taken into custody, Thibodeau reflected on the case that had consumed her for nearly a week. The murder of Marcel Fontaine had been solved, but the victory felt hollow. 2 lives had been destroyed by Marcel's past crimes, Sarah's through violence, and Vivienne's through the consuming need for revenge that had defined her entire adult life. The killer's pride in documenting her perfect crime had indeed become her downfall, but not in the way anyone could have predicted. Dr. Vivienne Leblanc had created the evidence that would convict her, not because she couldn't resist bragging about her brilliance, but because she wanted the world to understand that sometimes justice comes from unexpected sources, even when it arrives 20 years too late. 3 weeks after Dr. Vivienne Leblanc's arrest, Detective Thibodeau sat in the evidence room reviewing the killer's diary one final time before it was permanently filed away. The case had been closed, the confession recorded, and justice served for both Marcel Fontaine and Sarah Leblanc. But something in the diary's final entries continued to gnaw at her, a persistent whisper that suggested this story wasn't quite finished. The disturbing revelation came buried in the journal's last pages, entries written after Marcel's death but before Vivienne's arrest. In her moment of triumph, The killer had allowed herself to dream beyond her completed revenge, and those dreams were darker than anyone had imagined. Day 275. Marcel is dead, but my work is not finished. 20 years of planning has given me skills and knowledge that shouldn't be wasted. There are others who escaped justice, others who destroyed innocent lives and built new existences on the graves of their victims. Entry after entry revealed that Marcel Fontaine had never been intended as Vivian's only target. The storage unit contained files on 6 other individuals, each connected to crimes that had been covered up, dismissed, or forgotten. A real estate developer who had caused a building collapse through negligent construction, a pharmaceutical executive who had buried safety data about dangerous side effects, a judge who had taken bribes to reduce sentences for violent criminals. Day 278. I have begun preliminary surveillance of Thomas Meridian. His construction company's corner cutting killed 12 people in Atlanta, including a family with 2 children. He changed his name and moved to Charleston, where he's building luxury condos and living as a respected businessman. He doesn't know that justice is patient and that some debts can never be forgiven. The methodical planning that had characterized Marcel's murder was already being applied to these new targets. Vivian had created detailed profiles of their habits, their weaknesses, their loved ones. She had researched their new identities and studied their daily routines with the same obsessive precision that had made Marcel's death appear natural. Most chilling of all were the references to what she called her apprentices, individuals whose lives had been destroyed by these unpunished criminals and who might be willing to learn her methods of achieving justice outside the legal system. Day 283. Rachel Morrison responded to my anonymous letter. Her daughter was killed by the drunk driver that Judge Brennan allowed to plea down to community service. She wants to know more about alternative forms of justice. I will begin her education slowly, carefully. The work must continue, even if I am no longer able to carry it out personally. As Thibodeau closed the diary and sealed it in the evidence box, she realized that Dr. Vivian LeBlanc's arrest had ended one murderer's career, but potentially spawned others. Somewhere in Charleston, Atlanta, and 4 other cities, people were walking free who had no idea that their names were written in a killer's journal. And somewhere else, broken people were learning that revenge could be patient, methodical, and perfectly planned. The case of Marcel Fontaine was closed, but Detective Camille Thibodeau knew she had uncovered something far more disturbing than a single murder. She had discovered the blueprint for a network of vigilante justice that could be operating for years to come. Some secrets, once revealed, cast shadows that stretch far beyond their original boundaries.